This is random video game trivia to fall asleep to. This video will have no loud screaming or anything that will wake you up, but rather is an opportunity to just fall asleep to something nice. In the original Legend of Zelda, it is speculated that Christianity was supposed to be a big part of the game, or at least a core part of the game. In the Japanese version, the game originally had the magic book called the Bible. Of course, the shield has a cross on it. There is promotional art with Link praying in front of a crucifix, and there are certain items that still cause your character to clasp their hands together and pray, just like you would see in real life. Many people consider Oblivion to be the first game to have microtransactions with the infamous horse armor for $2 or $3. However, there's speculation that DLC or microtransactions came along before that. For example, games in the 80s and 90s could have you insert money for things such as extra items or health within the arcade cabinets. With the introduction of Xbox 360, the world was introduced to the idea of achievements in games. It's debated on which game technically had the first achievements. However, Perfect Dark Zero launched worldwide and is considered to be the first game on the Xbox 360. There's no shortage of facts for Pokemon Red and Blue, nor is there no shortage of things we can talk about that's broken or weird or strange, from the Dead Raticate theory to Lavender Town syndrome. There's plenty to talk about when it comes to Pokemon Red and Blue, but my favorite is the old playground go-to, which was that you could find Mew if you used Strength on a truck outside of a few different cities near the SS Anne. And while that turned out to be not true, it is possible to catch Mew in the original Pokemon Red and Blue using a series of glitches to unlock it, though it was found in the data. In Metal Gear Solid 3, there's no shortage of bosses that can be taken out in weird or strange ways. In fact, that seems to be the intended method, is to go around the bosses and find unique ways to take them out. One of the fan favorites being The End, who, if you simply save your game and don't play for a week, he will pass away while you were away. Final Fantasy VII is most people's favorite Final Fantasy. While I don't think this counts as a fun fact, Final Fantasy VIII is my favorite Final Fantasy. And the strange thing about Final Fantasy VIII is that it actually encourages you not to level up. In fact, the farther you can get in the game without leveling, the stronger you will be. As well as if you play cards more than you fight monsters, you'll be even more powerful. Continuing the Final Fantasy theme for a moment, I'd like to talk about another strange thing in Final Fantasy X, which is that one of the swords you can unlock requires you to not get struck by lightning 200 times in a row. You have to stand there and perfectly dodge them one after another for 200 counts to get one of the strongest weapons in the game. In the massively popular MMO World of Warcraft, in a location called Elwyn Forest, you can occasionally come across 5 children. If you follow them long enough, they'll take you to a house where they'll dance around into a pentagram, and you'll hear the message, "You will all die." It is hotly debated in the video game community what the first video game ever was. Some people, of course, will maintain that it is Pong, but there actually exists games before that were played on old radar equipment. Now, whether or not those constitute the first video games obviously is up for debate. In 2011, Blizzard had a tournament for StarCraft 2. The prize pool included thousands of dollars, but as a prize for some of the people who came in the lower rankings, they offered a measly 25 bitcoins, which at the time people thought was basically worthless. However, if the people who won that Bitcoin held on to those Bitcoins until today, they'd be worth over $1,700,000 for coming in not first place in a tournament. The original Donkey Kong game was actually going to be a Popeye game, but they failed to get the licensing to get the characters. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a longer fact, but it's really interesting to just think about, so let's go down the rabbit hole. If that had never happened, we wouldn't have gotten some of the most amazing games, Donkey Kong Country and Donkey Kong 64. And of course, without those games, the studio Rare who made them may never have become as popular as they are, which means we may never have gotten GoldenEye or Killer Instinct. And all of these games are influential in the grand scheme of things when it comes to shooters, collectathons, and fighting games. So it's strange how one character who came about because they couldn't get licensing, helped to launch a studio, who helped to influence gaming to this day. There's a popular rumor that flies around that John Romero, the creator of Doom 1993, was so engrossed in playing the game that he would often lock himself in his office and play at the cost of productivity. This prompted John Carmack to come chop down his door to get him out of his office. Although that seems to be more myth than truth, it did actually happen, but not for the reasons stated. However, they did expect for Doom to impact productivity, declaring that it would impact productivity worldwide when it finally came out because so many people would be playing it, and there is some truth to that as well. It was so popular at one point it was installed on more computers than Windows 95, which ironically may still be true today considering how few people probably run Windows 95. It is hotly debated what game is the most sold video game of all time. Many people consider it to be Minecraft with over 300 million copies sold. Other people consider it to be Tetris. However, Tetris does have maybe an asterisk next to it, as it's had a much longer time to sell and it's available on many other different platforms, and it's hard to keep track of how many sales they've actually had across different platforms. The Tetris company themselves released numbers saying 525 million. However, that includes a lot of mobile downloads, so it's questioned, does that count towards the sale of the game? If I were to ask you what is the longest running video game series or franchise, you'd probably be tempted to say Mario or Final Fantasy, and you would be close. However, you might be surprised to find out that Space Invaders is considered to be the longest running video game franchise, with the first Space Invaders being released in June of 1978, and the most recent release being Space Invaders World Defense on July 18th of 2023. Speaking of Mario, almost everyone knows by now that Super Mario 2 was in fact a reskin of Doki Doki Panic. However, it introduced some features into the game that we still see in the Mario world now, such as Luigi being a better jumper than Mario, and Princess Peach being able to levitate or float when she jumps. Some brave soul out there did the math on Animal Crossing New Leaf and discovered that it had well over 1 million words for animal text and dialogue in the game. That means there's more dialogue than there is words in the Bible. Speaking of the Bible, there are plenty of games that were made based on the Bible for the old systems and even new systems if you count Dante's Inferno for the Xbox 360. However, the most prominent example is Super Noah Arc 3D, which is a reskin of Doom made a little bit more family friendly. Did you know that Soulja Boy released his own video game console and was sued over it? Back to World of Warcraft, did you know that there are people who allegedly say that they got a job by putting on their resume they led raids in World of Warcraft? Which is an impressive feat considering that you have to coordinate multiple people across very difficult encounters. Before modern piracy, there was always still people who wanted to take advantage of getting games for no cost. A lot of older games relied on more primitive methods of keeping people from stealing their games, including things in their book that you had to put down in order to be able to progress in the game. One of the most famous examples of this would be Metal Gear Solid 1, in which in order to progress in the game, you had to call a certain character and you needed to write down their code, but their code wasn't within the game, it was actually on the back of the game case, which meant that you had to have the case handy in order to be able to read it. Now obviously you could go to the store and just write it down, but this was back in the day before the internet was super popular, which meant you couldn't just go on and Google what the code was. Now don't worry, I'm not going to leave you hanging. The code was 140.15. But that's a secret, so don't tell anyone. In the original Animal Crossing, you could actually find NES cartridges and play them within the game. This allowed you to play games such as Balloon Fight, Clu Clu Land, Donkey Kong Jr. Math, Excitebike, Golf, Pinball, and Tennis. There's also e-reader games and things such as Wario's Woods and Baseball from the island. There are a lot of Final Fantasy games, and I mean a lot, probably more than you think there is. I'm going to read from a list of Final Fantasy games, and I guarantee there's probably at least 10 on this list that you've never heard of. Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, and 4, of course, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, which was an online only game, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16, which just came out. But then you've got 10-2, 10-2 The Last Mission, Final Fantasy IV The After Years, Final Fantasy Grandmasters, Stranger of Paradise, Final Fantasy Origin, Final Fantasy Tactics, Tactics Advance, Tactics The War of the Lions, Tactics A2, Final Fantasy Revenant Wings, Final Fantasy Fortress, which was unfortunately cancelled, and Final Fantasy Tactics S. But wait, there's more. There's Before Crisis Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VII Snowboarding, Dirge of Cerberus Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VII Dirge of Cerberus Lost Episode, Crisis Core, Final Fantasy VII G-Bike, Final Fantasy VII Remake, 7 The First Soldier, Crisis Core 7 Reunion, 7 Ever Crisis, and 7 Rebirth. Final Fantasy Type O, then Final Fantasy XII-2, Lightning Returns Final Fantasy 13, Final Fantasy Agido, Final Fantasy Awakening, and then in the XV universe or Final Fantasy 15 universe, there's the Platinum Demo, the Justice Monster 5, A King's Tale, A New Empire, Knight's Night, Monster of the Deep, the Pocket Edition, and War for Eos. Then we have the sub-series such as Final Fantasy Artnix and Artnix Dive. We have the Brave series such as Final Fantasy Brave, Brave Tap, and Brave Exvius, War of the Visions. Then we have all the Chocobo games, which is going to be so many to read through, but let's keep going. Let's see if I can get this all in one take. Chocobo Mystery Dungeon, Dungeon 2, Chocobo Mysterious Dungeon for Wonder Swan, Chocobo Racing, Chocobo Collection, Chocobo on the Job, Chocobo Anywhere, Chocobo Land, a game of dice, Chocobo 2, Chocobo Anywhere 2 Escape, Ghost Ship, Choco Mate, Chocobo Anywhere 2.5 Infiltrate, Chocobo Anywhere 3 Defeat the Great Rainbow Colored Demon, Chocobo Mobile, Final Fantasy Fables Chocobo Tales, Final Fantasy Fables Chocobo Dungeon, Sid and Chocobo's Mysterious Dungeon Labyrinth of Forgotten Time DS Plus, Chocobo and the Magic Picture Book, The Witch, the Girl, and the Five Heroes, Chocobo Panic, Chocobo's Crystal Tower, Chocobo no Chocoto Nuen, also known as Chocobo's Chocoto Farm, Chocobo Racing 3D, Chocobo's Mystery Dungeon Everybody, Chocobo GP, and then of course Chocobo GP for the Switch. We're not even halfway through this list at this point. We have Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles Ring of Fates, Crystal Chronicles My Life as King, Crystal Chronicles Echoes of Time, Crystal Chronicles My Life as Dark Lord, The Crystal Bearers, Crystal Guardians, Crystal Defenders Vanguard Storm, Final Fantasy Dimensions and Dimensions 2, Dissidia, Dissidia 12, Dissidia Final Fantasy, Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia, Final Fantasy Explorers, Final Fantasy Explorers Forced, the Saga series, Theater Rhythm Final Fantasy, Theater Rhythm Final Fantasy Curtain Call, Theater Rhythm Final Fantasy All-Stars Carnival, and Theater Rhythm Final Bar Line. Then we have Final Fantasy Unlimited on PC, World of Final Fantasy Melee Mellow, Final Fantasy Adventure, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, Final Fantasy The Four Heroes of Light, Voice Fantasy Final Fantasy Airborne Brigade, Final Fantasy All the Bravest, Pictologica Final Fantasy Worldwide Wars, Final Fantasy Record Keeper, Heaven Strike Rivals, Final Fantasy Portal App, Mobius Final Fantasy the Digital Card Game. And the craziest thing about this list is not how long it is. In fact, if I was reading from a list about Mario or Sonic, it would be even longer than this. It's amazing how many of these games have so many spin-offs and how long they've been running for. And while these games have been running a long time, their storylines tend to bounce from place to place and change a great deal over time. The longest running cohesive storyline appears to be Tekken, with 20 years of games that all have one cohesive storyline, which is very impressive and strange for a fighting game. One of the most mind-blowing facts when it comes to video games is just how much money they make. Video games are said to make more money than TV, movies, and music all combined. To put it in perspective, Avengers made $1 billion after a few months. GTA 5 made $1 billion in a few days. In the original Space Invaders, after you clear some enemies, the enemies will drop down and speed up. This is actually a glitch and not intended. They found that the enemies sped up after you took out other enemies because it essentially freed up space for the processor and allowed them to move at a greater speed. And this isn't the only example of a video game bug becoming a feature. One of the most famous ones is Gandhi in Sid Meier's Civilization. Originally, there was a bug that guaranteed that Gandhi would be the most nuclear aggressive person in the entire game, ironic because it's supposed to be Gandhi. Eventually, that became known, and they kept it in kind of as a nod to the bug that became a feature. In fact, it's widely speculated that video game bugs led to the development of fighting games which now have combos. The original combos were allegedly bugs in Street Fighter 2, and they left them in when they found out how good it felt. We actually have the entire Grand Theft Auto series to thank to bugs as well. In the original GTA, the cops would bug out and randomly attack you, and people found that this was so fun that they made what is now Grand Theft Auto based off that bug. Adjacent to bugs, but not quite the same, let's talk a little bit about cheat codes. Cheat codes were developed because when testers had to test their game, they didn't want to play through like the beginning of the game over and over and over again, or very hard parts. So a lot of the developers developed cheat codes that would allow you to bypass certain parts of the game, or make it easier to get to the part where they want to test. These became so popular that people left them in the game. Also adjacent to video game bugs and cheat codes is the ever-popular video game Easter egg. Originally it was thought to be Adventure from the Atari 1979 that had the first video game Easter egg. However, there is now some debate and speculation around Starship 1 and other Atari games that may have had Easter eggs in them that we just never discovered. Currently, the Guinness World Records lists the game of Starship 1 as being the first video game Easter egg example, beating Adventure by 2 years. This fact gets repeated a lot, and it's debatable whether or not it's a fact, but it's fun. Pac-Man was originally going to be called Puck-Man on the arcade cabinets when they were brought to the USA, but they were afraid that too much graffiti would happen to make it something other than Puck-Man, so they changed it to Pac-Man. Even though Sony PlayStation and Nintendo are seen as competitors, the Sony PlayStation actually came about because of Nintendo. Nintendo and Sony were originally going to work together to create a disc-based 64-bit system. However, the deal eventually fell through when Nintendo stayed with cartridges, making the Nintendo 64. Sony already had this CD system and decided to make the Sony PlayStation and become one of their biggest competitors. Speaking of cartridges, although they can load data faster, they cannot hold nearly as much data. When you look at old games, a lot of old games would come with multiple discs. Some games would have 4 or even 5 discs in order to play all the way through. There's a rumor that Final Fantasy VII was originally going to be designed on the Nintendo 64, but with the size of the project, it would have filled over 13 cartridges. Did you know that Blizzard is responsible for many different genres of games being created? When they made StarCraft and Warcraft 3, both games had the ability to create custom games. This gave you different assets and the ability to import your own assets and create games. Now obviously the original intent of this was to create different maps for their base game, but also make your own little custom twist and rules on it. But this expanded greatly, which eventually gave us Dota, which created the MOBA genre that created League of Legends, and many, many different spin-offs that are now less popular as the Battle Royale genre takes over. Interestingly enough, tower defense games can also be traced back to Warcraft 3 and StarCraft 1 and 2 as originating there. And of course, they spread quickly to the Flash games that we saw spreading through the internet in every school in the late 90s, early 2000s. Despite the rising costs of video games and some games coming out for $120+ for the Golden Edition or Platinum Edition, they're actually seen as one of the most cost-effective forms of entertainment. Not only some games can you buy for $10 or $20 on sale and play for 100 hours, but they're also generally recession-proof. If we look at games that launched on the NES, some of them were $60, $70, and Final Fantasy III was even as much as $80 in some areas, which would be over $160 in today's money, meaning that for the same cost as you would have paid 30 years ago, you can get an adventure that is much, much better than anything that was ever made on the NES. While many games are rated M for mature, there's actually a rating above that called AO, or Adult Only. And there's only a few games that have ever gotten this rating, and many that didn't actually come out with this rating, but there's a few interesting ones to talk about in the AO category. In 2003, there's a game called Peak Entertainment Casinos, which provided an online gambling service, and they wanted to ensure that kids weren't allowed to gamble, so they encouraged the ESRB to give them an AO rating. This is the only game known that released that has an AO rating unrelated to violence or sexual content. Obviously, a lot of games that did release came with the AO tag were for sexual content, and I'm going to avoid talking about those, but there's a few other big ones. In 2015, Hatred came out. It got AO for blood, gore, violence, and strong language, and this game, along with its Steam greenlit campaign, had so much controversy due to the premise, which focuses on main character who basically goes and murders every person he encounters, including the police. Most recently, in 2018, there was a game called Agony that came out that was originally going to be rated AO for blood, gore, intense violence, nudity, strong language, and strong sexual content. However, they rated this game M after they put in a patch that removed most of that information. However, they did release an Agony Unrelated, which brought back all the other patches and uncensored content. It comes as no surprise in Super Mario that the Koopalings are named after famous musicians. You can see Ludwig, Iggy, and Lemmy's names obviously relating to real-life musicians. What you may not have known is that the fire-breathing Triceratops Reznor may be named after Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails, who also created the soundtrack for Quake. And then Quake adjacent, you have Doom 1993, which has a suspicious soundtrack that is inspired by Pantera, Metallica, Slayer, Nine Inch Nails, Alice in Chains. However, many people debate that it wasn't inspired by, but rather directly ripped from those artists. Let's go down a little rabbit trail of music. Now, this isn't necessarily a video game fun fact, but I do believe it's important to video games, and it's a fun thing to talk about. And that is, I think music design is often super overlooked when it comes to video games. In fact, I stand by that the greatest games of all time were to be a 10 out of 10 masterpiece. You have to have good sound design, and there is so much good sound design out there. Of course, Nobuo Uematsu with the legendary Final Fantasy series has so many soundtracks you can go back and listen to. Doom 1993 has one of the greatest soundtracks, even if it's debatable that some of the music is stolen. Ocarina of Time has some of the most recognizable tunes alongside with Mario. A lot of modern day games are called masterpieces, but they don't have a soundtrack that you can just dig into. The only modern game that I can think of that has a killer soundtrack is Stardew Valley, and that one you can listen to on repeat, on loop for hours on end, and it is just a masterpiece through and through. Did you know that Tetris was the first game to be played in space? Tetris traveled aboard the Soyuz TM-17 rocket to the Mir space station, where they played a Game Boy version of Tetris. Did you know one of the largest purchasers of PlayStation 3 was actually the US Air Force? They strapped together 1,700 PlayStation 3s to create one of the fastest supercomputers at its time. Speaking of the military, did you know that they developed their own video game, America's Army, to help recruit people based on how well they can play the game? The original Final Fantasy XIV, the online game, was received so poorly that the creators of the game actually destroyed the world, shut it down in canon, and rebooted to try and win the fans back. And we're thankful for they did, because Final Fantasy XIV is one of the best MMOs on the market to this day. Final Fantasy is actually named Final Fantasy because it was the Final Fantasy. It was the last-ditch effort of the developers to make a game before going bankrupt and quitting up on game development altogether. While we often think of online gaming as a modern invention, it's actually been around a lot longer than we thought. The SNES had a modem that would allow for online play, as well as many other older consoles. In fact, there was speculation that the NES was going to have a modem to allow it to play lottery games, but that didn't seem to come into fruition. You think lag is bad now, imagine trying to play on dial-up on an NES. The original Super Mario Bros. Instruction manual gave us a tidbit of information that's either been retconned, forgotten about, or they just really don't ever want to bring it up. Originally, the mushroom people were turned into stones and bricks, making them the blocks that you were breaking. Perhaps Nintendo thought it was too violent for Mario to run around breaking the bricks that are actually people, or maybe they just wanted to change the lore, but it doesn't seem like this has ever been brought up again in any Mario game to date. There is a popular myth that floats around that has now been deemed a creepypasta for the original Pokemon game called Lavender Town Syndrome, where they report that the creepy music and vibes of the town cause kids to harm themselves after listening to the music for an extended period of time. Well, obviously that's been proven to be fake, it's a creepypasta, not real. Pokemon has caused some harm. In fact, there are multiple episodes that had to be censored because it was giving people seizures. There is a record set in the speedrunning community for Nintendo 64's Mario 64 that is widely believed to be unbeatable. This is because it only happened because of a glitch that had something to do with the cosmic particles that are entering Earth's atmosphere. Widely seen as impossible to recreate, because how can you possibly do that? It's interesting to think that someone has a record because of a once in a lifetime sort of event, something that nobody else can recreate. Did you know many games still have loading screens? You just don't see them anymore. It used to be, of course, usual that when you passed from one area to another, you would read a loading screen that would take a minute or two and you could continue playing the game. Or you might have to switch your disc out. However, modern day games still have this limitation, but rather than having you switch out a disc or wait while you watch a bar load, it hides it with an animation that takes a long time. This is especially infamous in games like God of War and Tomb Raider, where you have these slow actions that you can tell are a loading screen if you know what to look for. As we're coming up on the 30-minute mark, I hope at this point you've fallen asleep. If you have, I hope you have good dreams, and I hope you have a good night. If you haven't fallen asleep, boy do I know that pain. The nights where you just try and sleep and you just can't fall asleep no matter what you do, whether you get up for 30 minutes and try falling back asleep, scroll on your phone for 30 seconds, try to go back to sleep, endlessly scroll TikTok or Reddit. If you're experiencing that, know that I'm truly sorry. I know that that is a frustrating thing to experience. But hopefully you're not at that point. Hopefully you've drifted off into sleep and you can have a wonderful night.